Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara updates the nation on Soviet missiles in Cuba. In South Vietnam, search teams scour the jungle for a missing U.S. pilot. President Kennedy speaks out on faith, David Janssen stars in The Fugitive, and Wilt Chamberlain sets another NBA record. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Muriel cigars. It makes no difference where you are with farm or city folk. The smoking crowd knows Muriel's a very special smoke. The extra mild tobaccos have a taste that is sublime.
Why don't you pick one up and smoke it sometime?
Try a Muriel Corona, long for luxury, light for pleasure. A premium cigar for 10 cents.
Muriel cigars.
At the Pentagon yesterday, Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara said all Soviet offensive weapons have been removed from Cuba. In a nationally televised program, Mr. McNamara and John T. Hughes of the Defense Intelligence Agency displayed reconnaissance photographs and charts to counter charges that the Kennedy administration is dismissing the threat in Cuba.
Since July 1, over 400 reconnaissance flights have been flown over the island of Cuba by U.S. military aircraft. The reconnaissance flights recorded the removal of the offensive weapon systems from Cuba, and they continue to provide the foundation for our conclusion that such weapon systems have not been reintroduced into the island.
Mr. Hughes said the Soviets have destroyed launch pads in Cuba and removed military equipment and weapons systems.
In addition to removing equipment from the site areas, and in addition to destroying the fixed facilities in the vicinity of the launching positions, the Soviets carefully cleared all the remaining operational equipment and debris from their site locations. High-altitude aircraft swept the island, and all the naval facilities and seaports were carefully checked. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States did not just ensure that the missile alone left the island of Cuba. We ensured that the missile system left the island of Cuba. All components of that system were carefully counted as they left the site area, as they reached the port motor pools, and as they were loaded on Soviet ships.
Mr. McNamara concluded the program with a brief summary of the Defense Department's findings.
The Soviet Union did attempt to establish clandestinely a major offensive weapons base in this hemisphere. The United States was able to deter this effort, and the United States is now monitoring the remaining Soviet personnel and equipment in Cuba through reconnaissance activities of the type which we have described to you today.
Even so, many Republicans remain unconvinced that all offensive weapons have been withdrawn from Cuba. At today's press conference, President Kennedy was asked what more he could do to convince his critics.
Well, I don't know what more we can do. Mr. McNamara went to great length. As he pointed out, he exposed a good deal of information, and also he went further than under ordinary conditions we would have liked to have gone in telling our story. If obviously their offensive missiles were found in Cuba, contrary to Mr. Khrushchev's pledge, it would raise the greatest risks, much greater, in my opinion, than we faced in October, and we faced great risks in October. But to take the United States into that path, to persuade our allies to come with us, to hazard our allies, as well as the security of the free world, as well as the peace of the free world, we have to move with hard intelligence. We have to know what we're talking about. We cannot base the issue of war and peace on a rumor or report, which is not substantiated. This issue involves very definitely war and peace. And when you talk about the presence of offensive weapons there, if they are there, I think the Soviet Union is aware, and Cuba is aware, that we would be back where we were in October, but in a far more concentrated way. Now, it may be that there are hidden away some missiles. Nobody can prove that they're, in the finite sense, that they're not there, or they might be brought in. But they're going to have to be erected. And we continue complete surveillance. They have to be moved. They have to be put onto pads. They have to be prepared to fire. And quite obviously, if the Soviet Union did that, it would indicate that they were prepared to take the chance of another great encounter between us with all the dangers. Now, they had those missiles on the pads, and they withdrew them. So the United States is not powerless in the area of Cuba. But I do think we should keep our heads and attempt to use the best information we have. But we have to deal with facts as we know them and not merely rumors and speculation.
Later in the conference, the president was asked if there was any chance of eradicating communism in Cuba during his term.
We're quite obviously hopeful that it can be eliminated. We don't know what's going to happen internally. There's no obviously easy solution as to how the communist movement will be removed. One way, of course, would be by the Cubans themselves, though that's very difficult given the police setup. The other way would be by external action, but that's war, and we should not regard that as a cheap or easy way to accomplish what we wish. We live with a lot of dangerous situations all over the world. Berlin is one. There are many others, and we live with a good deal of hazard all around the world and have for 15 years. I cannot set down any time in which I can clearly see the end to the Castro regime. I believe it's going to come, but I couldn't possibly give a time limit. I think that those who do sometimes mislead. I remember a good deal of talk in the early 50s about liberation, how Eastern Europe was going to be liberated. And then we had Hungary and Poland and East Germany, and no action was taken. And the reason the action wasn't taken was because they felt strongly that if they did take action, it would bring on another war. So it's quite easy to discuss these things and say one thing or another ought to be done. But when they start talking about how, and when they start talking about Americans invading Cuba and killing thousands of Cubans and Americans with all the hazards around the world, that's a very serious decision, and I notice that that's not approached directly by a good many who discuss the problem. Yes, Mr. Robert.
In the jungle terrain of South Vietnam today, American search teams tried to locate a U.S. Air Force co-pilot missing since his fighter-bomber crashed yesterday. The missing soldier is Lieutenant James Janssen of Winter Haven, Florida. The dead body of the plane's pilot, 40-year-old Air Force Major James O'Neill of Huntington Station, New York, had been found in the wreckage 200 miles northeast of Saigon. The fighter-bomber, which had been dropping incendiary bombs on a suspected concentration of Viet Cong guerrillas, crashed after Major O'Neill had reported engine trouble. Meanwhile, on Monday, General Earl G. Wheeler, Army Chief of Staff, returned from South Vietnam, where he had awarded medals for bravery to 13 Americans for their conduct during the Battle of Ap Bac on January 2nd. 5 U.S. helicopters were shot down in that battle, and 3 Americans were killed. After awarding the medals, General Wheeler told the assembled men, quote, "This is a dirty, nasty little war, and you can get killed in it just as dead as if you were landing at Omaha Beach. But this is also a lonesome war, and you don't have the might and majesty of the United States of America, as we did at Omaha," unquote. The general's words, according to one pilot, were, quote, "just what the men needed to hear." Upon his return to Washington, General Wheeler held a press conference where he predicted that victory over the communists would be achieved by 1966. I'll have more news for you after this message.
To relieve sinus congestion and head cold's distress, get Dristan nasal mist. Dristan mist penetrates deep, opens swollen passages, clears congestion, thus relieves pressure, pain. Seconds later, nostril sprayed with Dristan mist shows free breathing restored. For fast relief, get Dristan mist.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
In the ballroom of Washington's Mayflower Hotel this morning, President Kennedy spoke at the annual presidential prayer breakfast. The event drew more than 1,000 persons from the cabinet, Congress, diplomatic corps, various government agencies, and private life.
You and I are charged with obligations to serve the great republic in years of great crisis. The problems we face are complex, the pressures are immense, and both the perils and the opportunities are greater than any nation ever faced. In such a time, the limits of mere human endeavor become more apparent than ever. We cannot depend solely on our material wealth, on our military might, or on our intellectual skill or physical courage to see us safely through the seas that we must sail in the months and years to come. Along with all of these, we need faith.
The annual breakfast is sponsored by Senate and House prayer groups in cooperation with the International Christian Leadership Conference, an organization of laymen of all faiths.
This morning we pray together, this evening apart. But each morning and each evening, let us remember the advice of my fellow Bostonian, the Reverend Philip Brooks. Do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be stronger men. Do not pray for tasks equal to your powers. Pray for powers equal to your tasks.
On Monday, the ABC television network released its evening schedule for next fall. While many programs remain subject to change, one definite entry is a new hour-long drama called The Fugitive. Advance word about the show has been extremely positive. 31-year-old David Janssen plays Dr. Richard Kimball, the fugitive of the title, and Barry Morse, a British actor, portrays Lieutenant Philip Gerard, Kimball's relentless pursuer. Dr. Kimball is a physician wrongly convicted of his wife's murder and sentenced to death. In a freak accident on the way to death row, the doctor's train derails, allowing him to escape and begin a cross-country search for the real killer, a one-armed man. In a recent interview, Mr. Janssen, who previously starred in a CBS series called Richard Diamond, Private Detective, was asked about the challenges he had faced in establishing himself as a Hollywood actor.
Trying to eat was one. That was a big problem. It's like any other profession. You try to be as good at what you do as you possibly can, and you hope that someone will agree with you, you know. If you learn your trade and really are prepared to do a professional job, you will work in some capacity in this business and make a decent living out of it. You may not be a big star or whatever that quote is, but I've been around an awfully long while, but I really haven't starved.
He was asked if The Fugitive had been inspired by the case of Sam Shepard, an Ohio doctor convicted of murdering his pregnant wife. Dr. Shepard, whose 1954 trial caused a media sensation, is currently serving a sentence of life in prison.
I don't know about the writer's original, idea, except that it was an original idea. I don't know what he may have borrowed from in his own head or what, but there really is no relationship to Dr. Shepard, other than the fact that...
the fact that you were both doctors and
yes,
you both lost your wives.
There are some similarities, but he went to jail, and the fugitive, by a quirk of fate, was able to escape and is now trying to survive. I guess that's the theme of the show, survival.
The Fugitive, currently scheduled for Tuesdays at 10 p.m., will premiere on September 17th on ABC. In a speech at the White House Tuesday, President Kennedy outlined a new approach to mental illness and disabilities.
Our chief aim is to get people out of state custodial institutions and back into their communities and homes without hardship or danger. Today, nearly 1/5 of the 279 state mental institutions are fire and health hazards. 3/4 of them were opened before World War II. Nearly half of the 530,000 persons in our state mental hospitals are in institutions with over 3,000 patients, getting little or no individual treatment. Many of these institutions have less than half of the professional staff required. 45% of them have been hospitalized for 10 years or more.
Congress, although faced with a large budget deficit next year, is expected to implement the president's program. Substantial pressure by mental health professionals and organizations has been building. In addition, an estimated 15% of Congress has had direct family experience with this problem, as has President Kennedy. Sports, right after this.
He burns me up.
Don't get angry. Bill's having a tough time. He's upset, emotionally upset.
Yes, but he's always that way.
I realize that, but he can't help it. That's what we must try to understand.
How true that is. People who habitually react this way may be emotionally ill. It's not the way they want to be, it's the way they have to be, because of something inside them. But remember, these people can be helped. Sometimes professional help is needed, but very often it's the sympathetic understanding of the people around them that makes the big difference. That's why it's so important that you try to understand rather than criticize. Show concern rather than irritation when you deal with such people every day. Learn more about how to handle mental problems. Send for the new free booklet, How to Deal with Mental Problems. Write Better Mental Health, Box 3000, New York 1, New York.
At Cincinnati Gardens tonight, the Royals survived a 27-point fourth-quarter barrage by Wilt Chamberlain and held on to beat the San Francisco Warriors 134-129. Chamberlain was only 7 for 21 in the first half, but scored 16 of his patented fall-away one-hand jumpers in the second half to achieve a game-high 56 points. His 27 points in the fourth quarter set a new Cincinnati Gardens record for a single period. Oscar Robertson scored 33 for the Royals. And finally tonight, Lamar Hunt, owner of the American Football League champion Dallas Texans, will likely move the team to Kansas City, Missouri. Mr. Hunt, a multimillionaire oil man, and Jack Stedman, general manager of the club, were in Kansas City last night discussing the move with members of the city council. Since the inception of the AFL in 1960, the Texans, like the NFL's Dallas Cowboys, who debuted the same year, have played their home games at the Cotton Bowl. But despite the team's success on the field, Mr. Hunt, after 3 years of losses at the gate totaling an estimated $1.25 million, believes Dallas cannot support two professional teams. He had preferred a new location to which he could easily commute from Dallas, but was unable to secure Tulane Stadium in New Orleans because the university did not want its football program to compete with a pro team. Mr. Hunt was then convinced by Mayor H. Rose Bartle to consider Kansas City. And now, it appears the Texans will make the move, and of course change their name, before the 1963 season. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Thursday, February 7th, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.